have the gavel. We're gaveling the hearing to order. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Competition Policy, Antitrust, and Consumer Rights, entitled Competition Policy for the 21st Century, the Case for Antitrust Reform. Good afternoon and welcome to our witnesses. I want to thank Senator Lee for his friendship. We've been working together for a long time on these issues, and I look forward to that continuing. I appreciate his passing of the gavel to me, whether it was voluntary or not. And I also appreciated his text last night where he asked me if I should be called chair, chairwoman, or Klobuchar, which was a new one, so that's nice. We're here today to examine, as you know, the state of competition across our economy and to consider what should be done to protect, preserve, and foster competition in the 21st century. American prosperity was, of course, built on a foundation of open markets and fair competition. It is competition between companies that give consumers lower prices, forces manufacturers to constantly innovate and improve their products. It forces companies to pay fair wages because there's competition for those employees. Competition provides opportunities for entrepreneurs to start and grow new businesses, fueling future economic growth. But if you look at our markets today, we see big cracks in that free market foundation. We see more and more consolidation. In so many areas, markets aren't as competitive as they once were, and the devastating impact of COVID-19 on small and medium-sized businesses threatens to make things even worse. We have lost hundreds of thousands of small businesses. But even before the pandemic, well before the pandemic, it was clear that America had a major monopoly problem. An example, more than 2/3 of U.S. industries have become more concentrated even between the years of 1997 and 2012. Now, we all know that the problem is most obvious in technology industries, and we thank our friends in the House, Chairman Cicilline, Chairman Nadler, for the hearings that they conducted all last year and the report, and I would suggest people read that report. At the root of this power lies the ability of a few companies to act as gatekeepers. Thanks to Senator Lee, we had a hearing together on one of those gatekeepers, Google, recently, last year, which in this case controls over 90% of the search market, giving it the leverage to hold companies hostage, but even as we recently learned, entire countries hostage, by using its leverage to threaten these countries that they will just pick up their business and their search engine and go somewhere else. That, my friends, is a sign of a monopoly. If there was, in fact, greater competition in the tech market, you would see companies that would come up with bells and whistles that I think would remedy some of the problems we have today. If there was true competition, we could have small businesses, maybe they would have been Instagram or WhatsApp, that could have risen up, developed bells and whistles, developed better privacy protections, developed better policies for handling misinformation, developed better arrangements for paying for content. But if you have big monopolies that buy up all that potential innovation, that buy up those small companies, you lose the ability to get at those major challenges. Over time, if left unchecked, big companies dominate markets, exclude their rivals, and buy out their competitors, even small competitors, even what is known as nascent competitors. Perhaps we should just look at the words of Facebook head Mark Zuckerberg. In his own email, he said this: "These businesses are nascent, but the networks established, the brands are already meaningful, and if they grow to a large scale, they could be very disruptive to us." Disruption actually is a positive word in tech. Disruption means that you're disrupting the status quo, that you're bringing in new ideas and new competitors. But in this sense, when Zuckerberg looked at some of these smaller companies that were coming up to compete, he thought they would disrupt what? Disrupt the monopoly power of Facebook. As he wrote in another email, when you're building a monopoly, quote, "It is better to buy than compete." At some point, and I say this to all the senators on this subcommittee, we need to reply to those emails, not by just holding hearings and throwing popcorn at a screen at whatever CEO we want to throw that popcorn at. No, not by just getting a soundbite for the day, but actually responding with action, by responding with legislation. And with all due respect to the views of a few of the witnesses here today, I don't think the status quo is going to do that for us. One of the points we need to make today is that this isn't just about big tech. America's market power problem cuts across our entire economy. We see it in agriculture. A number of Republican senators just yesterday approached me about this. We see it in online travel, where when people go to these travel sites, they think they have all these great choices, but in fact, over 90% of the market is owned by just two of the companies. They simply own the brand names under them. We see it in the live event industry, where one vertically integrated company dominates ticketing, event sponsorships, and performance venue booking. We see it in everything from cat food to caskets. So it is no wonder that 2/3 of Americans have come to believe that the economy, quote, "unfairly favors powerful interests," end quote. So why has this all been happening? Why is there a monopoly problem? A big reason is that the courts have become increasingly closed off to antitrust actions. Cases like Trinco, Brook Group, and most recently Ohio v. American Express have made enforcing our antitrust laws more challenging. Add to that the fact that Congress and multiple administrations have failed to ensure that antitrust enforcement budgets have kept pace with the demands of a growing and increasingly complex economy. In 1980, when the Justice Department's Antitrust Division was working to break up AT&T, the division had 453 lawyers. 453 lawyers. This includes during the time of Ronald Reagan. By 2017, it had 330 lawyers. The FTC is also a shadow of its former self. It's 1,719 employees in 1980. It's fallen to 1,102 by 2018. Our agencies cannot fight the biggest companies the world has ever seen with duct tape and Band-Aids. And I know that Senator Grassley, who's been such a leader on this, agrees. We are together leading a bill to inject some more investment in these agencies, because we know they actually deliver money when they bring these cases to the government. We know it's worth the money. And we also know that we can do it in a way that isn't on the back of taxpayers by simply changing the fees assessed on large companies. For them, it's a drop in the bucket when they bring these mergers before the agencies. The purpose of the antitrust laws is to protect competition. In America, when we see a problem, we take action, we figure out what is working, what isn't working, and we fix it. That's why I introduced the Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement and Reform Act with many people on this committee, including Senator Leahy, Blumenthal, and Booker, and many others off the committee have since joined. The bill would increase the baseline for antitrust agency budgets, update the Clayton Act to stop harmful consolidation, outlaw anti-competitive exclusionary conduct by dominant firms, and I'm here talking about markets that are already highly concentrated, and make other reforms to protect competition. I'll end with this, because I truly, with Senator Lee and I starting a new year and so much interest on the Republican side as well as the interest we already had on the Democratic side, this has always been a bipartisan issue. Our founding fathers recognized the dangers of monopoly power. The Boston Tea Party and our fight for independence was partly motivated by a British government-granted monopoly on the tea trade. And America's long tradition of promoting pro-competition policies have often been led by Republicans. Senator Sherman of Ohio was a Republican. Teddy Roosevelt, most notably, the nation's most famous trust buster, a Republican president. Our current monopoly power problem didn't just come out of nowhere during the last administration. It is the product of decisions by Republican and Democratic administrations over the last 40 years. It took both parties to get us into this situation, and it's going to take both parties to get us out of this situation. One good example of that, just yesterday, Senator Kennedy and I introduced a bill to help newspapers and broadcasters negotiate on a level playing field with the powerful digital monopolies that now dictate how consumers get most of their news. I think it's 3 out of 4 consumers get their news off of Facebook and Google. We have strong support for this bill. Senator McConnell was on it last year. Senator Durbin have supported this bill, and the companion bill is with Representative Cicilline and Representative Buck over in the House. Again, bipartisan. So we must find common ground on these issues. At stake is nothing less than the future of our economy and the way of life that it supports. This is about saving capitalism and building an economy that works for all Americans. It's about laws that throughout our history have rejuvenated capitalism. The breakup of the rail trust, the breakup of Standard Oil, to the breakup of AT&T. What did we get out of that? Lower long distance rates. We got an innovative cellular phone industry. We got a strong AT&T that still employs many people, with their own former chairman saying they were a stronger company because of the breakup. We all want successful American companies, but if we want to see the rise of the next generation of great American companies, we need to reinvigorate our competition policy. I look forward to the witness's testimony. I turn it over to Senator Lee. Thank you. Of new beginnings, we have Senator Ossoff has joined our subcommittee, and we're excited about that. We'll recognize other people as they come along, but thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce the witnesses today. Our first witness is George Slover. We're going in opposite order because we're, disrupting, I guess, things today. A senior policy counsel at Consumer Reports, where he focuses on antitrust and competition policy issues. Prior to his position at Consumer Reports, he has had 3 decades of federal government policy experience, including 9 years in the House Judiciary Committee, 2 years at the House Energy Committee and Commerce Committee, and 11 years at the Justice Department's Antitrust Division. Our second witness today will be Ms. Ashley Baker, the Director of Public Policy for the Committee for Justice. Her area of focus include the Supreme Court, technology and regulatory policy, and judicial nominations. She's an active member of the Federalist Society. She serves as a member of the Regulatory Transparency Project Cyber and Privacy Working Group. She also engages in policy analysis and outreach on legislation and regulations related to these issues by writing op-eds, letters to Congress, and regulatory comments. Our third witness is Mr. Barry Lynn, Director of the Open Markets Institute. Prior to his position as director of the Open Markets Institute, Mr. Lynn spent 15 years at the New America Foundation researching and writing about monopoly power. And before that, he was executive editor of Global Business Magazine. He has authored numerous articles and several books on the damaging effects of concentration of political and economic power, including most recently, Liberty from All Masters, the New American Autocracy versus the Will of the People. Our fourth witness will be Mr. Jan Rybnicek, counsel at the law firm of Freshfields, Bruckhaus, Derringer, where he focuses on antitrust law. Mr. Rybnicek represents clients related to U.S. merger control, joint ventures, and antitrust litigation. He previously served as an attorney advisor to former Commissioner Joshua Wright of the FTC. In addition, he's an adjunct professor and senior fellow at the Global Antitrust Institute at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University, where he teaches courses on antitrust law and economics. He's an active member of the ABA's antitrust section. Our fifth witness, who will be with us remotely, is Professor Nancy Rose. She is a professor of applied economics in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where her research and teaching focuses on industrial organization, competition policy, and the economics of regulation. Previously, she served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economic Analysis in the Antitrust Division, the U.S. Department of Justice, and Director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Program on Industrial Organization. Her research includes analysis of antitrust law and economics, economic regulation, and firm behavior in a variety of transportation and energy markets, as well as of labor, rent sharing, and determinants of executive pay. I want to thank our witnesses and all of their credentials that they bring with them for appearing before us today, and I look forward to your testimony. Please stand. I will swear you in now. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before the subcommittee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You will be seated. I'll recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes of testimony each, and we'll begin with Mr. Slover. Thank you very much. I'm going to go through these issues just one by one. I guess I'll go to maybe you, Mr. Lynn, first. When Mr. Rybnichek was talking about the fact that there's not really concentration, he acknowledged that there was by sector, but not locally. I've just looked at all this literature that Professor Rose talked about, and I think there is a lot of concentration going on. I think people feel it out there, and it's everything from walking into the Senate and hearing some pretty conservative Republicans talk about how their cattle ranchers are feeling right now, to hearing from just regular people who are trying to buy things and find competitors and they can't. Could you give me 30 seconds on, even outside of tech, what you're seeing with concentration?
No, I mean, this is one of the most important things that's happening throughout the American society, which is this concentration of power at the local level. You know, and just one example is in hospitals and in healthcare and clinics. I mean, we've seen massive concentration in particular regions, in Baltimore, in Pittsburgh, in Cleveland, and wherever you see that kind of price, that kind of concentration, prices skyrocket, and the delivery of service in many ways goes down. We've seen the stripping out of clinics and small hospitals across America. Rural areas have been especially hard hit. But as you mentioned, this is something that is affecting, heartland communities all across our country. It's retail, it's agriculture, it's, wherever you look. There's not a single sector where you're not going to see significant concentration, sometimes extreme concentration over the last 20 years.
Yeah, one of my favorite moments of this was John Oliver did a segment and he went through all of the concentration examples from cat food to online travel, and he ended the segment by saying, if it's enough to make you want to die, good luck, because now there's only 3 casket makers, and he showed them, and since then one has bought the other, so there's only 2. So next thing, we talked about the need for the agencies to be as sophisticated as the people that they're trying to regulate and challenge, which is a big task given that these are the biggest companies the world has ever seen. And you don't want to neglect other areas outside of tech because of the understandable focus. So just to see where people are philosophically, or do you think these suits were brought by the Trump administration, Macon Delrahim, who Senator Lee and I worked with extensively, Chairman Simon, these are Republican appointees. They brought these suits at the end, as was pointed out by, I think, Mr. Lynn, joined by Democratic attorney generals, at least in the FTC suit, with others interested, of course, in the Justice Department suit against Google. Do you think it was a good idea to bring those suits? Just yes or no? Mr. Slover?
Absolutely yes.
Okay. Ms. Baker?
Yes, depending on the, overall, yes, I am in favor of enforcement, yeah.
Okay. Mr. Lynn?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Rybnichek?
I'm not going to opine on the suits. I mean, antitrust is a fact-intensive exercise, so
Okay.
I think...
Okay, that's fine. And then Professor Rose?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I think she said clearly in a very professorial way. Okay. So I just say that because I think there is some widespread agreement across the country and across the aisle on these suits. And so if you do that, as I said, you can't take them on with Band-Aids and duct tape. And I really did appreciate, outside of your views on those lawsuits, Mr. Rybnichek, that you are of support funding these agencies. And I don't know if you want to take this, Mr. Slover, but as having someone that's worked extensively at agencies in the past, these are agencies right now, the numbers are a shadow of their former selves when you look at even during the Reagan administration. And yet we're going to be asking them to take on these major cases that we tend to agree with as a country need to be taken on exclusionary conduct. Senator Grassley and I have a bill that he's very devoted to change the fee structure that hasn't been changed since Hart-Scott-Rodino passed for major mergers, so that we can get some more funding to be able to better adequately take on these major companies. Could you comment on that?
Sure. We think that additional resources are clearly needed. I've stated that in my testimony, and I think the bill that you have with Senator Grassley is a good way to help get more of those resources to the enforcement agencies. It's essentially a user fee on the biggest mergers that create the most work for the agencies, and the companies can clearly afford to pay it.
Okay, very good. Next thing, so we've got the funding for the agencies, and then we have exclusionary conduct. And I've asked a lot about this because people say, okay, let's say we do something to make it easier to go after mergers in the future, but what are we doing about what's happening right now? I mean, we don't even have the data anymore at the FTC that actually Casper Weinberger started having collected decades ago. That's part of our bill, is to collect that data again. But people see this, how this is this intractable. What can you do about conduct that's going on right now, like predatory pricing, where you try to drive your competition out of business with extremely low prices so you can raise them later? That's what predatory pricing is. It seems real good at the beginning, and then it's a monopoly, and they can just jack up the prices. Exclusive dealing, where you force your customers to agree not to deal with your competitors, or strategies to cripple your rivals. And I read again from Mr. Zuckerberg's exact words from his email, in which he said that these businesses are nascent, but the networks established, the brands are already meaningful, and if they grow to a large scale, they could be very disruptive to us. And then he goes out and buys them with the words, "It is better to buy than compete." I guess I would go to you, Professor Rose. Exclusionary conduct, can we actually, I know you see it as a problem, but can we actually do something about it?
I think we can, Senator, and I believe that what we need, however, is a recalibration of what the antitrust laws mean, what Congress intended when it passed them. We're seeing court decisions that are really nullifying, I think, that congressional intent, and even just basic understanding of what exclusionary conduct is and a business judgment. The examples you gave are terrific. You know, we basically, I think it's almost impossible to successfully bring a predatory pricing or predatory behavior case at this point, and that shouldn't be. I mean, that if you believe in competitive markets, if you believe in small businesses, if you believe in the kind of entrance that that some here today have talked about, you want to give them a fighting chance, and you don't want to allow incumbents to drive them out of the market before they've even had a chance to compete.
And
so I think there are a variety. Sorry.
Okay, no, well, when Mr. Ribnichek has this argument that, oh, hey, they've won 85% of their cases in court, so there must not be a problem. To me, I get this, but to me, it means that they're not bringing all the cases. One, they don't have the resources, and two, they know how the courts are going to rule.
I think that's right. And I think the third factor is that you have to, when you've got a legal environment, a judicial environment that's as hostile to considering exclusionary conduct as the present environment is, you worry a lot that if you bring a case, not only will you lose, right? The agencies can take a loss, that's not a problem, but you worry that you'll create bad precedent, bad case law. And the shining example of that from recent years is the American Express case. The DOJ won at the district court level, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we have a truly terrible Supreme Court decision that not only meant we couldn't enforce against those anti-steering provisions in the credit card market, crippling competition in the credit card market, but it also now means that lower courts are using that to mean basically anything's fair game in a platform industry or in a two-sided market. And that's really devastating.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to go back to you, Mr. Silver, on a second round. I know you want to answer this, and I also want to talk about mergers, but I thought I'd end and shifting the burden on mergers and how that could be helpful. But I wanted to lead with exclusionary conduct just because we can't pretend we don't have a monopoly problem right now. And that is the bill that I just introduced with Senator Kennedy to give an even playing field for our journalists. And I know that you and I both agree, I've been on forums with you about the need for looking at consolidation in the media, and that a vibrant and independent free press is vital to our society and our democracy. You've been a journalist yourself. I'm the daughter of a journalist. Our free press right now is under threat. And we saw this played out in such a big global way in Australia, where we realized even a company the size of News Corp was at least rose up and was trying to challenge this. And literally these tech companies threatened to just take their marbles and go home and leave an entire country with basically no search engine and losing their biggest platform. Obviously, it didn't work as the world looked and regulators across the world started looking at this. But this is the philosophy of this bill, that we have to have an even playing field and allow people to negotiate. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important bill. It's very important that we even the playing field. I think it's also important for us to look ahead and actually begin to plan how do we reconstruct the entire marketplace for advertising in the United States. I mean, advertising from the founding of this country, advertising has played a fundamental role in creating the environment in which the free press can operate. And, it was, advertising is what allowed publishers not to depend on government handouts. Advertising is what allows publishers and journalists to not depend on philanthropy. Advertising is what allows publishers and journalists to be free thinkers and to say what they want. And the advertising that exists out there should be attached to publications. It should not be captured by and diverted by the intermediaries. That's what we're seeing today. Is we see intermediaries, gatekeepers, choke point corporations exploiting their power to steal other people's money. And they're starving the free press in the process, and they're starving our democracy.
To the point. Thank you. With that, I turn it over to Senator Lee. I'm talking about original intent, though. That's what I thought. Okay, next we go to Chairman Durbin. Thank you for joining us.
I wouldn't miss it. This is the first voyage of this subcommittee under the chairmanship of Amy Klobuchar. We certainly know Senator Klobuchar knows antitrust. In fact, she's written a book. It's called Antitrust: Taking on Monopoly Power from the Gilded Age to the Digital Age, coming soon to a bookstore near you. And I'm told it's only 624 pages long. So it's just in time to become a runaway bestseller summer vacation beach read. I'm sure it will be a success.
You may be surprised, there are cartoons.
I'm looking forward to the pictures.
That's one night's reading for Senator Lee.
Yes. And
Piece of this. I've tried to orderly go through this as much as we can at a hearing, but we started by talking about the concentration. I asked some questions which I think are really important for a bill that's bipartisan I have with Senator Grassley on funding the agency, and there's some widespread interest in that from our witnesses. And then we talked about the exclusionary conduct and how much that is an issue right now, because you can change everything you want going forward, but if you don't look at some of the stuff that's already happened, just as they did with the AT&T breakup, you're not going to get very far. But I did want to talk about future mergers, as we see a bunch of small businesses have closed down. We've seen even the beginnings of attempts at mergers in things like delivery, food delivery, which would have cornered the market for one company. And I know one of those mergers where they backed down after a lot of pushback from many people. But I think we're going to see more and more of this. And I appreciated Senator Hawley's questions about when you have a company that is so dominant, why are you just automatically okaying purchases like we saw? And he asked this of Mr. Lynn. And one of the things I think would be helpful are some of the merger changes for the standards. I'm looking at you, Mr. Slover, that we put forward in our bill. In fact, shifting the burden to the company that is attempting to make the merger, and this wouldn't just be in tech, to create on them, if they're either really, really big, as he's pointed out, the merger is really big, or if they are over 50% market share and they're trying to purchase a small company that's right in their wheelhouse. The standard that I've suggested is that you would have to shift it to the burdens for those, shift the burden on those kinds of requests to the company to show that it does not produce an appreciable risk of of reducing competition. Do you want to talk about that, Mr. Slover, as we look at going forward?
Yes, thank you. So there's already a presumption in the law, the Philadelphia National Bank decision, and it's too often lost sight of. And I think one of the great strengths of the proposal that you've got is that you essentially revive the Philadelphia National Bank standard, and you provide some flesh on the bones and some guidance in particular situations. What does constitute enough concentration, enough power to raise concerns where that presumption ought to shift? And it's a shifting presumption. It's not a conclusive presumption. The parties are still able, as they were in the Philadelphia National Bank decision, to prove that their merger was not going to harm competition. But I think it's an appropriate thing to have a shift, and I like the way your bill does it.
Okay, very good. And one thing we didn't cover, Mr. Lynn, unless I missed it when I was briefly out, is just how monopoly power can disproportionately hurt small businesses owned by African Americans, minorities, women. And I think part of it is kind of understandable. When you have groups that are coming in and are starting new businesses, they're gaining economic power, it makes it really hard for them to get in if there's just a monopoly that dominates. Do you want to briefly talk about that? We've been joined by Senator Blackburn, so I'm going to turn over to her to ask some questions. Mr. Lynn.
No, and this is a fantastically important point. I mean, monopolization is and has always been a direct threat to both sort of racial and gender equity. You know, in the case of, race, I mean, what we see, monopolization results in, as you say, it becomes very difficult for small businesses, whoever owns them, to sort of get into the market and to stay in the market. But we also see all these problems on the consumer side, which is like we see health deserts, and who do the health deserts end up hurting for most? It tends to be people, often rural people, but very often people in minority communities. Food deserts, it's the same thing. We just actually saw with USDA, there's a very large sort of shift of money to make up to deal with black farmers who did not receive funding for, government support for many years that was equal to that of their white neighbors. And that was in large part often due to the power of monopoly corporations. So what we see is throughout our society, whether it's minority businesses or women-owned businesses, monopolization makes it much more difficult, and often the effects themselves fall much more sort of firmly upon the minority communities and upon women.
Okay, very good. I'm going to turn over to Senator Blackburn for her questions. I also would note that Senator Cotton has also been joining us remotely, which we appreciate. I like to note that because you don't see everyone that is with us at the subcommittee. Senator Blackburn. And I'll just note, starting with what Senator Blackburn was talking about, evening the playing field for our journalists. We have a bill that was just introduced. I hope she'll consider it, that we've had Senator McConnell was on in the past and is supportive of. Senator Durbin, Senator Rand Paul is on there, and it is also a bill that Senator Kennedy and I really are devoted to getting done, given I wish we weren't there. I wish that we were doing something about monopolies, but this is going to allow our content providers to better negotiate with what are clearly monopolies. Then we have the bipartisan agreement generally about funding our agencies. By the way, we almost got the Klobuchar-Grassley proposal on at the end of last year in the budget, the bipartisan budget agreement. We just had some issues over with the House Republicans, but I think we can overcome those. And there was general agreement between both parties in the Senate on doing that. So that's a big priority of mine going forward. We have the exclusionary conduct with all kinds of ideas on that, including from Senator Hawley and others. And that's a piece of the bill that I just introduced. And we're going to look at breaking down some of the pieces of the bill and working with senators on those. And then we have the merger standards, which I just discussed with Mr. Slover. I actually think collecting data would be helpful as well at the FTC. As I said, they used to do that, and then we maybe would not have any disagreement on that. And I think it would better help our regulators to focus their resources on where we need to do it, so that, you know, we're not off on marijuana or things like that. Okay, that was maybe an unnecessary dig, but some of the things that had happened in the past. At the same time, one of the points that I wanted to make today was, you know, those lawsuits against Google and Facebook, that massive effort was done during a Republican administration. And now we have a Democratic administration that's carrying on the torch. That is how effective antitrust enforcement has been done in the past, because some of these cases, as we know from AT&T or Microsoft, they're not just limited to one administration. So I want to thank all the career people that have been laboring in these efforts, and I thought this was a good initial discussion. I was asked by some reporters, well, are you going to focus on one thing like tech? And I said, although it's been discussed quite a bit, no, because this is a big problem and we're going to go big to have a general discussion for our first hearing, and then we'll start breaking it down by different industries, but all focused on trying to get things done, which we will go back to as a touchstone at every single hearing. So I want to thank you all for joining us. Every one of you made contributions to this discussion, which I truly appreciate. And I loved, maybe I'll end with Mr. Lynn's words, this is the battle of a century, and it feels like every century we take on these laws in a big way, and this is our moment. I want to thank our staff and all of the other staffs that worked on this. It's incredibly complex, but it also can be a lot of fun. If you enjoy history and you enjoy complex matters, you found the place. So with that, we will leave the record open for 1 week. And I want to thank everyone for joining us and look forward to seeing you again. The hearing is adjourned.
Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Langford, Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Lujan, Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Braun, no. Ms. Stabenow, Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, Ms. Cortez Masto, aye.
Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye.